Colleagues. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the annual EDI lecture hosted by the Institute for Educational and Social Equity. We're delighted that you have been able to join us today to engage in what we believe, and I'm sure you do too, is an essential discussion on equity, diversity and inclusion. The Institute is dedicated to fostering EDI across various sectors, providing unique qualifications such as the EDI Fellowship, which I understand many of you may well have already engaged with, and offering insightful lectures on accountability and leadership. I just want to go through a few formalities with you before we introduce our speaker. So, what we are asking for you to do today is, first of all, can you just in the chat provide your affiliation and your name? And if you add that to the chat down below, that at the side, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
A bit watery.
In the meantime, is it possible for you to make sure that your microphones are off? Just keep those muted. During the meeting, we are going to disable the chat for the duration of the lecture, after which we'll remove this and move to our question and answer section. So if we can just take a moment to make sure that we've been able to make those updates to our settings, we are going to try to begin with the lecture. So I'm going to pause now and hand over to Paul, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for joining us at this, our annual EDI lecture. I see some of the fellows, and you're welcome, and I see some of the advocates, other advocates, you're welcome, and I see every one of you, and you're welcome. Keep putting your names and affiliations in the chat so we see you and we acknowledge you. I met Stuart a couple of years ago at a conference at Hackney Council. I was really impressed with his passion around social justice, in particular racial justice. And he doesn't mind being described as the CEO who is woke. And that struck a chord with me. So Stuart is Chief Executive at Westminster City Council, and he has been described as being on a relentless crusade to implement diversity and inclusion policies throughout Westminster City Council. He is highly regarded amongst London council CEOs, and prior to that role at Westminster City Council, he was head of city management and communities, overseeing a range of projects and solutions to community and other business intelligence issues. Stuart previously worked at Westminster City Council as head of road management, and also worked for the Isle of Wight Council between 2006 and 2013, as well as Southampton City Council, where he was Director of Place. Stuart describes EDI as being integral to his leadership. So it gives me great pleasure, colleagues, to introduce our speaker for this, our annual EDI lecture. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. As Paul has said, my name is Stuart Love. I'm Westminster City Council's Chief Executive. I have been now for 7 years. I also chair what's known as London's Tackling Racial Inequality Programme, and this is a London-wide London Council's initiative. It's an absolute honor and a privilege for me to be speaking to all of you today. So thank you to everybody who's here, and especially Paul, thank you very much to you, both for inviting me to be a fellow of the Institute and again, to speak today. And I believe that this subject is always important, but especially so now with what's going on across the world, what's happening in other countries, and equally what is happening in this country. And I will come on to that a little bit more as I go through my talk. I should also say I had a look at the number of people and who had registered for this event, and there are a number of people in the audience who I look up to, who I've learned from and continue to learn from, and Professor Miller is one of those. So it is more than a little intimidating to be talking to this audience. I just want to say a few things before I start to give a little bit of context. So first one is I am going to use the phrase global majority when I talk. Global majority is a phrase that the staff in our organization have said that they want us to use. And I've always been clear that decision was not mine. It was a decision for our staff. But for what it's worth, it is a phrase that I really like, because the first time I heard it, it made me sit up and think. I'm also not here to say that in any way, shape, or form we've solved the problem, or I have. That's not why I'm here. And in fact, I am going to say some things that I think are quite challenging about my organization and the sector I work in as a whole. I should say Westminster City Council is a great place to work, but there are a lot of issues that need addressing, and I will touch on some of those as I go through. I often get asked, occasionally to my face, quite often behind my back, why a white South African man is standing up, or in this case, sitting down and talking about EDI. And I think it's important to say I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. I'm a product of that criminal privilege that the apartheid regime afforded me. And that, for me, I carry a lot of guilt about that. And that is one of the things that drives me in this space. Apartheid had many crimes. And one of them was that while I was growing up and when I was at school, Black children in South Africa were denied an education. And in this country and in the West, I see leaders judging Africa and its leaders without remembering that we were complicit in and sometimes directly responsible for that denial of education. And the other thing that I find incredibly worrying at the moment, and my talk is going to be about hope, but there is some really challenging things going on in the world at the moment. I hear the language of apartheid. I hear the language of apartheid across the world. I hear it especially in America, and I see that and hear that seeping into the media and the politics of this country. And I'm here because of my position. I am a leader. I have responsibility. I have the ability to effect change, and therefore I have to use that authority, the responsibility that I have to effect change and to drive EDI. It is absolutely a responsibility and an accountability that I have and should have, and all leaders should have. Where you lead people, this has to be a key part of your leadership competence. I immigrated here in 2002, and I still remember Nelson Mandela stood in Trafalgar Square and talking about this country, and London in particular, as being this rich, multicultural melting pot. And I think that there are times now when Nelson Mandela would be turning in his grave. I moved here and was very quickly disabused of this utopian view that I had of London. And I'm not going to go into all of the reasons why, but one of the things that I observed, and I was very helpfully asked this question when I went through the interview for this job. The politicians who appoint me asked me what my experience of growing up in South Africa would bring to this role. And I spoke about apartheid. I spoke about the end of apartheid. But what I also said was, in this country, the problem around racism, I believe, is much more insidious. South Africa needed a sledgehammer to crack apartheid. A sledgehammer wasn't going to work here. And therefore, in some ways, the insidious nature of the problem made it that much more difficult to tackle. Something else, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. I don't like the word ally. I never have. I don't like how it makes me feel. For me, being an ally is being somebody who empathizes. It's not necessarily about somebody who takes action. So I do refer to myself as an accomplice. I believe that that is much more where my responsibility is. I have to have skin in the game. I have to be prepared to take risks. You call me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I will be there, and I'm driving. And I think that this is critical to leadership in this space. And as I say, I am going to come back to that. Just looking at my organization, it's existed now for 65 years. And I am the latest in a long line of white male chief executives. We have only ever had a white male chief executive in the 65 years of our existence. Yet we are, I would say, probably the most diverse part of the country. And our organization's leadership has never, ever reflected that. And I've worked in Westminster City Council. This is my second stint there. And I saw my predecessors, when asked by people in our organization why the leadership was not reflective of our communities, why there were no global majority people in our middle and senior management tiers, all shrugging their shoulders and saying, oh, well, nobody ever applies for these jobs. And that shrugging of shoulders and worse by the leaders of the organization is what has led to the fact that we are significantly underrepresented in those middle and senior management levels. When you look at the demographics of our organization and of our communities, it has also led to the wicked pay gaps that our organization has, that we absolutely have to tackle, and we have to tackle now. It is decades of racism and sexism in this case that have led us to the position that we're in, and failure, at best, failure to address that by the leaders of the organization. For me, EDI has always been a moral imperative, and I have learned to my cost through some of the mistakes I've made that not everybody sees it that way. And it's really important, I think, to understand that EDI in leadership drives organizational success. It drives innovation, and it drives resilience in organizations. I said this was my second stint at Westminster. When I came back to Westminster back in 2015 now, I came back to an organization that was being run by the same 50 white men who were running it when I'd left it 10 years before. And if you think that's an exaggeration, it is, but by two. My predecessor had a chief of staff, and she joined the organization about 6 months before I came back. And we had something called the corporate leadership team, which was supposedly the top 50 leaders in the organization. And she told me that the first one of those meetings she walked into was like walking to a brick wall. 50 people in the room, all white, 48 of them men. And Westminster City Council at that point had completely stagnated. It wasn't doing anything innovative. It was seen as very average in local government terms. It was very inward-looking, no outward-looking, no learning from others. And a very big part of that for me was exactly that leadership cohort that all looked the same, thought the same, and did the same things, and convinced themselves that they were the best. And there is a lot of evidence, particularly in the private sector, that diverse leadership teams create better outcomes. And in the case of the private sector, that's the bottom line. And there's a lot of evidence and studies being done into this around businesses who are in the upper quartile for diversity in terms of their leadership, outperforming their competitors by around about 35%, or 35% of those businesses outperforming their competitors. In the public sector, it's sometimes a bit more difficult to pin that down. But I believe, and I will shortly take you through a slide that I think demonstrates that inclusive and equitable leadership in the public sector leads to better services, and really importantly, leads to much more trust from our communities to whom we're delivering those services. And I just want to give a very small example from within my own organization. And this relates to health inequality that we know exists, and we know that London has an enormous problem with health inequality in particular. And the structural racism that has created a lot of that. But in our organization, we have a public health function. And going back 5 or 6 years, that public health function, the entirety of the leadership of the public health team was white. We also at the time were the lowest in the country for vaccination uptakes and other related matters from a public health point of view. We brought in a new director of public health, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about her top team and the need to have a more diverse set of people and voices around her table. And she did that. And she now talks very openly about how important that was to helping drive improved health outcomes. We're no longer the worst in the country in terms of vaccination uptakes. But a big part of that is because we have a different set of people challenging, thinking differently, but also listening. Previously we would very paternalistically tell people what they needed to do. We now listen, and we take no for an answer when people explain to us why they might not be prepared to take up a vaccine, etc. It's fundamentally changed our organization, but also it's changing and improving the outcomes for our communities. For me, one of the things that I observe, and a lot of people have said this, so this isn't just coming from me, but an organization's values reflect the values of the leader the leaders of that organization. And I'm going to use that as a lead into why I believe leadership is so important, and especially that leadership has to be authentic. But I just want to start with 2 macro examples. When Boris Johnson was Prime Minister of this country, I saw racism get a whole lot worse. And that is something that has been, again, backed up by what we've seen in the form of studies and reviews of that period. And in our organization, we had a member of staff made a complaint because one of our politicians had been walking around the floors of our office referring to women who wore burqas as letterboxes. When I confronted her with that, her entire defense was, well, the Prime Minister said it. And that the fact that racism became so much more overt and people felt that much more emboldened was, for me, a reflection of Boris Johnson's Prime Minister, how he led the country. And I work in a political environment. I have to be balanced on the side. We'll give another example where I think there was a failure of leadership. And that was in the riots that we saw on our streets following last year's general election, a general election that was absolutely soaked in racism, what led us to that point. And when we saw what happened on the streets of this country, and the aftermath of the general election in the summer last year, which isn't that long ago, it's only 7 months or so ago, Keir Starmer stood up and he said, I'm not going to shy away from calling this exactly what it is. It's far-right violent thuggery. And in saying that, he shied away from calling it exactly what it was. It was racism, it was Islamophobia, and if the people on our streets were not white, it would have been called terrorism. And as a result of that, I saw in our organization, I saw people who were scared, and I saw in our communities exactly the same thing. But what I also saw was a lot of leaders, especially white leaders, hiding, not knowing what to do, not standing up to this. And again, that tone that is set from the top is so important. EDI has to become part of the culture of an organization, part of its DNA. And that requires leaders to make it so. It requires leaders to ensure that it's part of every strategy, it's part of every discussion, and it is part of every decision. And I believe that there are 3 key responsibilities for leaders when it comes to EDI. The first one is don't outsource EDI. You can't. Your job as a leader is all about people. So this is the job. And I see too many people outsourcing EDI. I said earlier that I chair the Tackling Racial Inequality program for London. We had an event a couple of years ago to launch the program. And the morning we set aside for London's local authority chief executives. And we invited all of London's local authority chief executives to the event. Not one turned up. Not a single chief executive did. And my sector is still very much dominated by white leaders. What they did was they sent their HR directors. This is not something that you can outsource to your HR function. It's not an HR responsibility. It is your responsibility as a leader. HR can support, they can engage, and they can facilitate. Leaders have to lead and take that responsibility and accountability. And the other thing, the other place where I've seen EDI outsourced to, and I see this actually more in the private sector than in the public sector, is where organizations take what tends to be the most senior Black woman in their organization and say to them, you must now chair our staff network. And they do that and say, well, that's EDI done. I'm going to go off and make money or whatever they believe their job is. And what that creates is an absolutely toxic environment. It is toxic for the person who's been instructed that they have to take on chairing the network. And it's also toxic for the people who work in that organization who see that their leaders are not taking this seriously and are not holding themselves responsible and accountable. So I'll say again, this is not something that can be outsourced. It's part of the job. And I firmly believe it is a leadership competence that we should all be held accountable for. The second thing that I would say, and this will be different in all of your organizations, but whatever you do, do not fall back on existing policies and processes and behaviors when it comes to EDI. And I will speak for my organization as well as what I've seen elsewhere, but our existing policies and processes and behaviors are written through with the biases that have led to the problems we've got at the moment. So my view is scrap them and start again, and make sure in doing so that you don't build in a different set of biases or re-establish the biases that existed before. Bring different voices in, have others help you and challenge yourself. Be curious, constantly ask questions, and be self-aware, critically important in this space. The third thing is around accountability and leaders ensuring that they are accountable themselves, but that they also hold others to account. The truth is, in this space, in my organization, I'm not actually held to account. I have tried my hardest. The politicians in my appraisals and my objectives, EDI does not form part of that. So I stand up and I say to the organization, I say to our politicians, and I say to our communities, hold me accountable for the change you want to see and that we need to see. I have to be accountable. But I, in turn, hold all of the leaders of our organization accountable alongside me, because this cannot just be vested in one person. So I take accountability. I also have to say, I have been incredibly fortunate when I came into this role and started my approach around EDI. There's somebody in the organization who has constantly supported me, challenged me, and also held me to account. So that accountability to another has been key to me, and it is a key part of accountability. We have introduced in our organization something we call accountability forums, and this is a mechanism that I use to hold leaders of the organization accountable in this space. And I've modeled it on how people go about, again, particularly in the private sector, doing budget setting with, the chief executive in the room. In this case, it's me. I have the HR director and one or two others, and I hold our executive directors and their leadership teams to account for the changes we need to see in our organization, for driving down the pay gaps that exist in our organization, and for ensuring that representation is equitable. And I'm going to come back to that word representation, because I do know that it can come across as problematic, and I just want to put a bit of context around it. People notice what leaders do, and they notice what we don't do, and we will prioritize what's important. And so that accountability piece, making people accountable, is also demonstrating how important this is to our organization. And again, we talk about EDI as a leadership competence, not an add-on, not something that gets parked when the pressure's on. It's part of everything we do. It has to be. I think one of the things so I've mentioned three things that I think are critically important. There's something else that for me sits across all of that is crucial, and that's authenticity. as a leader in this space, you have to lead authentically. I am not interested in leaders in our organization who can quote word for word, the pillars of the Westminster Way, which is our people strategy, or all of the actions that sit under our anti-racism strategy. What people need to do is turn up authentically, give of themselves, and be able to explain why this is important, why it's important to them, and do that in a way that is entirely authentic. If you are not, people will see through it in seconds. And it can become incredibly undermining. It can also lead to something far worse. And this is a phrase that Rosemary Campbell-Stevens, who may be in the audience, introduced into our organization. And it is something to watch out for, and that is malicious compliance. And malicious compliance is where you have leaders who will pay lip service to what we're doing around EDI, who will say to me in rooms that I'm in, the things that I want to hear, but when I'm not there, their behaviors will be the opposite of that. And also, where their frustrations with me will be taken out in other bits of the organization, because that's easier than it is for them to challenge me. And what in turn happens with that is the narrative around EDI becomes very toxic and challenging, and leads to people talking about EDI as a tick box exercise, and question marks over whether people are being given or appointed into roles based on merit or not. All of which is nonsense and completely undermines everything you're trying to do. And one of the things I think is really important for us as leaders is we have to do the really difficult stuff in this space. 3 very wise people in talking about this said to me, when it comes to EDI, there are 3 types of people. There are people who are on the bus, there are people who are waiting to get on the bus, and then there are people who need to be pushed under the bus. And frankly, as leaders, I think we need to do some more pushing, and sometimes we need to push a lot quicker than we do. In our organization, 80% of our organization, and you can argue about whether it's 80% or 85%, but the fact of the matter is 80% of our organization are either on the bus or want to get on the bus. And my job, I believe, is to invest in that 80%, and the 20% should leave. I don't want to spend time catering for the lowest common denominator or trying to change their minds. I want to invest in and work with people who want to make our organization better and want to lead with EDI at the heart of what they're doing. I am just going to very quickly share one slide with all of you, just to demonstrate the changes that have happened in our organization and the outcomes as a result of those changes. So if I can just... It looks like that's working. Can everybody see that? Yes, great, thank you. So I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but I just want to start with the red line here where my cursor is. And that red line is our staff engagement scores. So this is what people tell us it's like to work in Westminster City Council. And if you go back in 7 years to 2017-18, those engagement scores were in the low 60%. And that's average in local government terms. And over those 7 years, we have led our cultural transformation with EDI at the heart of it. And now our last year's staff engagement scores were at 79%, the highest the organization's ever had. And it now makes us comparable with really great leading organizations, makes us a great place to work. Still more for us to do. And the line above that, the yellow line, is our resident satisfaction. So our resident satisfaction, which has always been high, it's significantly higher than the local government norm. That line doesn't particularly do it justice, but it is a gentle increase over time. There's a little peak there, but our resident satisfaction now is at round about 90%. And our residents are saying they're much happier to listen and talk to us. I want to quickly talk about leadership, and particularly when it comes to global majority staff. the number of hands have gone up. The green line here, back in 2017-18, our organization in 2017-18 was 32% global majority. Our our senior leadership, which is about 220 odd people, was 5% global majority at that time. That's disgusting. It's shocking and speaks to some of the problems I mentioned earlier. We are now at about 34% of our senior leaders come from a global majority background. The demographics of our organization have changed over that time as well, which is a positive, but we're now 44% global majority as an organization. So again, we have a gap and more work for us to do. Our population in Westminster, about 44% of our 44% of our population identifies coming from a global majority background. So again, our leadership, we've come a long way. There's more for us to do. And our pay gaps have reduced over that time. What we have seen happen in our organization is the gender pay gap has reduced much quicker than the ethnicity pay gap. And there is a really sad fact here, which is, and you know, I have seen this, I've experienced it. When it comes to issues such as this, it's much easier for our organization to get their head around reducing gender pay gaps than it is to deal with our ethnicity pay gaps. The second you introduce race into the conversation, things become much, much more difficult and challenging. And I am sorry to say that to all of you, but it is just a fact of what we've experienced. So the overriding message there is that change has made us a better organization, both internally and in terms of the services we're delivering for our residents. So some of the lessons for me about this, and I've already spoken about the importance of authenticity. I think it's also really important to be prepared to make mistakes. And that's something that, you know, I have made a lot of mistakes. Our organization has over time, but we need to be prepared to learn from those mistakes and constantly learn and try to be better. During the pandemic, when George Floyd's murder happened, and I just want to be clear that it's really important to me that from our organization's point of view, George Floyd's murder was not the catalyst for this. This is something that we were absolutely focused on prior to that. But what George Floyd's murder did was we had we had a weekly all staff get together, and we regularly have about 600 people turning up to that. And when George Floyd was murdered, we had a lot of white colleagues coming along to these all staff sessions and saying that they knew that they needed to be there. They just didn't know what to say or how to say it. And really helpfully, the rest of the organization turned around and said, listen, just turn up imperfectly rather than not turning up at all. And so that became a little bit of a mantra for our organization, but also helped us to create safe space where people could have conversations that were difficult and felt that they were able to talk to each other about some of their concerns and some of the challenges facing each other. And that bit about creating safe spaces in our organizations, that's such an important thing for leaders to be able to do. Leaders must model the behavior. This comes back to what I said before about an organization's values reflect the values of its leaders. We must model the behaviors that we're expecting from others. And that's, I mean, it is self-evident and it sounds fairly simple, but I have seen that fail. And I will use the example again of the riots that happened back in the summer of last year, and seeing lots of leaders in our own organization, white leaders, hiding, and that not being good enough in terms of our organization and our communities. Something else that's really important is data and the use of data. So this is something that, as I said before, is just so close to my heart. It's at my core. But one of the things I've had to learn to do is to use data to help demonstrate the change so that people can see what's going on, but also to help ensure that those around us, those who might be making decisions, understand and see the importance of this. And I just quickly want to give an example. again, going back 6 or 7 years, when I came into this role, I really wanted to introduce something into our organization called the Rooney Rule. And it's based on something in American football. I won't go through the detail of it now, but in essence, it requires when you are recruiting that you have a diverse shortlist put in front of the decision makers. And this was something I wanted to do as part of our approach to inclusive recruitment. And I had one HR director and HR lawyer after another stuck in front of me and to be told, you can't do this, it's unlawful, etc. And then I asked that we published our ethnicity pay gap alongside our gender pay gap in that year where we had to publish for the first time gender pay gaps. And when I saw the data, I did turn the air blue, and I made it clear to those same HR lawyers and professionals that were in the room at the time that I wasn't going to take no for an answer now, that they were going to go away and tell me how we were going to introduce this, not whether or not we could. And as a result, we now have something that we call positive action in our organization that requires diverse shortlists. People to be on those shortlists based entirely on merit. And that, going back to the graph that I showed you, where we've seen the improvement in representation at those that senior leadership tier, that's been a really big part of that. Just having those diverse shortlists has helped us to transform that senior leadership cohort. I also think one of the things people have said to me throughout this is, Stuart, you're creating, you're causing us all to have really difficult conversations. And the thing that I would point to goes back to our staff engagement scores that I showed you on the graph and the improvement that we've seen there and how we've gone from average to where we are now. How we have approached EDI and how we have used it at the heart of everything we've been doing around culture has been a unifying force in our organization. It absolutely has. It is a big part now of why 79% of our organizations say that they're engaged with the work that they're doing and feel that they belong in our organization. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but this can only be embedded through culture, not through process. So don't fall back on process. Don't look to that as being the solution. This has to be about culture. I have been asked a few years ago, I was constantly asked actually, what happens when you leave the organization? And then this all falls over. And my response then, and it would be exactly the same now, is if when I leave the organization, this all falls over and goes backwards, then my time as a chief executive can only be judged as an abject failure. This cannot be vested in one person. This has to be vested in the entire leadership of the organization. I'm happy to be able to say that we've just recently had a peer review, and one of the things I asked the peer review team to look at was how embedded EDI was in our organization. And they came back and told me and our political leaders that it is now embedded, that if I was to leave the organization tomorrow, this continues. And that is absolute music to my ears. That's part of getting us to the point where the DNA of the organization, EDI is part of and at the heart of the DNA of the organization. I also think as leaders, we have to stand up to resistance. We have to be strong. It can be very difficult sometimes, and we have to be relentless. And to use a better phrase that Professor Miller, I heard speak using, there can be no respite. There can be no respite for me and for people in my positions in this space. We have to keep going. We have to continue. We have to drive the change that we need to see. And I feel very strongly about this. We need to not allow others to hijack this agenda. And I've seen this happen in all sorts of ways. I see how the right has hijacked Black Lives Matter. Professor Miller referred to woke earlier. And yes, I do talk about the fact that I am proud to be called woke and occasionally being accused of being too woke. But I think some people don't like the word woke. What's really important for me is the definition. The definition of woke is being aware, especially of social problems such as racism and inequality. And for me, that should be the human condition. We should all be aware of social injustice, inequality, and racism, and more importantly, tackling it. I also am worried about the rhetoric that is coming out of America at the moment, talking about DEI, as they call it. And I see some of that rhetoric being played out here as I've said previously, in our politicians, in our media, and one of the really destructive bits of the rhetoric, from my point of view, is this assumption and assertion that is made that DEI or EDI is all about giving people jobs or roles that are not based on merit. And that is absolute nonsense. That is not what this is about. It is about equity. It is about ensuring inclusiveness and ensuring equity, equal opportunity for all. As I've said before, every single leader has the power and the responsibility to create inclusive and equitable organizations and spaces. So make sure that you are accountable, that you're holding yourself and others to account. Check yourself constantly. Are you doing all that you can to foster inclusive environments? Are you challenging the biases and systems that exist in your organization? Because they do. So do what you need to challenge those. As I've said, my view is rip them up and start again. Whatever you do, don't fall back on them. It's really important also, I think, for leaders to mentor and sponsor diverse talent across the organization. We did an exercise in our organization, again, with all of our senior leaders, and we asked them to list down the last 5 people who they'd mentored. And then we asked them to list their ethnicity. And what we found, and it was 95% of our senior leaders, of our white senior leaders, had only mentored white colleagues. And there is something, I had been very fortunate, not because I was any better than anybody else, but because I'd been approached, and I had mentored 3 Muslim women in our organization. And I learned so much more from them than they did from me. And that has been one of the things that shaped me and my time as a chief executive in Westminster. And that importance of mentoring and sponsorship is also the learning that comes back to leaders, where you are fostering that diverse talent. And I'm going to finish by coming back to where I started. And I just want to reference something that is a report that was written by the Staff College. It's about 5 or 6 years old now, and it is unfortunately still as relevant now as it was then. The first couple of paragraphs, this is aimed at local government and the public sector. The first couple of paragraphs, the report is called Leading in Colour, the Fierce Urgency of Now. Those first couple of paragraphs refer to the snowy white peaks of the public sector. And unfortunately, that remains the case. So my message at the end of this is largely aimed at white leaders in this space. And that is to say that when it comes to EDI, being an ally is not enough. Allies stand in support. Accomplices take action. Allies acknowledge inequalities. Accomplices disrupt those inequalities. And allies will voice their agreement with warm words, whereas accomplices will take risks and take action. And that, in the space of EDI, is how I believe we all have to lead. And white leaders especially, I think, need to sit up and take that responsibility and accountability. You know, if you had something that was a matter of life or death, and this is a matter of life or death when you think about the health inequalities that exist in our society, would you want somebody to support you with warm words, or would you want somebody who is going to help you get it done? And I know my answer to that is the person who's going to help get it done. So as a leader, when it comes to EDI, you have to drive change, you have to demand it, and you have to ensure that it happens. Thank you very much. I will stop there.
Well done. Well, wow. Thank you so much, Stuart, for your very insightful lecture. I know that the audience have a number of questions, and we've already had some hands up. So just before we sort of transition from this very insightful lecture from Stuart, really that focuses on accountability in leadership, I would like to, if I can, Stuart, just open the floor for questions and answer session. But slightly before I do that, I'd like to start with two questions of my own, if that's okay. So, Stuart, you touched on your upbringing during apartheid in South Africa. So my first question is, how has your experience shaped your perspective on privilege and accountability in addressing inequities today?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that experience, as I said, I carry a lot of guilt, and I always will, for my upbringing and the privilege it's afforded me. But I think what's absolutely crucial is that I have to use that privilege to help change the issues and problems that I see in our organizations, in our society. I have a responsibility to use that privilege to ensure that we don't ever see something like apartheid again, but actually to help right the wrongs of apartheid. And that sounds very grand, and I know I'm not doing things on a scale that, you know, but in every little bit here helps. And so that is one of the things that that absolutely does drive me. It's critically important, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Stuart, for that. So my last question is that you've emphasised the need for leaders to move beyond being allies and become active accomplices in the fight for equity. In your view, what specific actions, you talked a little bit about the mentoring, but I'm just thinking if there's any more, what specific actions should leaders take to actively sort of disrupt systems of inequality within their organisations?
I think one of the first things I would do is use the people in your organizations. You know, all of your organizations will have people in there who want to help make the change happen. Engage them in this. Get, you know, what we've done in our organization, the inclusive recruitment approach, everything we've done with the organization. So, you know, when I first came into the role, we didn't have any staff networks. They have grown up organically, not because we set them up corporately. They've grown up organically in the organization because people saw, you know, I mentioned authenticity. People saw an organization that was eventually prepared to listen and eventually, more importantly, prepared to act. So started engaging with us, created the staff networks, and our staff networks have shaped our approach to recruitment. You know, from start to finish, not just the kind of diverse shortlist, but everything from how we go out and advertise roles all the way through to final interview. So use the people in your organization. I think that's absolutely key. I also think it's important to be bold, to take risks. You have to. You know, to affect the kind of change that needs to be seen, you have to take those risks. And, you know, think about all of what I've said about policies and processes and everything else that exists in your organizations, and think about their role in the leading to some of the problems that you may have. And that's, for me, why processes are not the answer to this. It is culture, but those processes will have supported what you've ended up with now. So get rid of them, start again, and use your organization to help you rewrite to help you determine the kind of organization that you want to be, where people want to be, where, you know, we spend a lot of our time at work. So let's make our organizations great places for people to be.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. So so we're going to move on to the questions from the audience. I know that there are a few questions coming through, and we're going to start with Sarah. So Sarah, I just want to invite you to take your mic off mute. Welcome, and I'll hand over to you for your question.
Thank you very much. So my name is Sarah Gashier. I'm a workplace wellbeing consultant, and I've been working in health inequalities since about 2017. And also I'm a lived experience disability consultant as well. So thanks, that was a great lecture. I just had a couple of points in regards to some of the stuff that you talked about. So firstly, I think so leaders make commitments to EDI, but I mean, what does accountability actually look like in practice? Because I've seen all too often that EDI can be a bit tokenistic, and some leaders might take a neutral stance on discrimination, which to me isn't accountability. You mentioned in your second point about you know, that 20% of the people that need to be thrown under the bus. But I'll just throw the question back to you. Do you throw them under the bus? Because sometimes, I mean, you mentioned, I think specifically you said, you know, well, they should leave, but the problem is they will never leave. That's the issue. So I think that's something just I've noticed from my experience. I've done a lot of work in this area, that they will never leave, and to be truly accountable, you as a leader need to do something about that, because to me that's accountability. Because how can you have it embedded in your organization if there is still discrimination going on at the same time? And I think also, like, focusing on one marginalized group, like you've discussed a lot about race, but I haven't heard anything about disability. And that can sometimes widen the disparities, and there isn't equity. So I've also worked at some academic institutions, most recently at UCL as well, and I often see in I worked with hundreds of organisations to implement workplace wellbeing, and sometimes when there is bullying and discrimination, the leaders at the top of the organisation will say it's out of my hands and take a neutral stance. So it's HR's issue; they have to deal with bullying. But again, to me, that's not taking responsibility or being accountable. So if you have something to say about that, that'd be great. And also, my last concern really is, you mentioned about the Rooney Rule. And I have a couple of issues in regards to that, because actually there's a great book I'd recommend everyone to read if you haven't, called Alchemy. It's more about behavioral economics, but he touches on a fantastic example of using quotas, like hiring quotas. And he uses the example of, for example, you know, if you're going to just hire for race, and you've hired 10 Black people and they're all from Nigeria and they're all from the Igbo tribe, well, there's no cultural diversity, there's no socioeconomic diversity. On paper, it looks like you have diversity, but you know, just because someone is Black and they even come from the same country, they are still very different ethnically. So I think that's just a good example to highlight that as well. So yeah, I think that kind of covers most of the things that I wanted to cover. Thank you. I think I've gone on for too much.
That's absolutely fine, Sarah. So there's quite a lot there. Thank you very much. Really insightful. So I wonder if, so that we can make sure we get through as many questions as possible, is it possible to just identify perhaps one aspect, one area from Sarah's questions and comments that you might want to reflect on in your experience, in your current role?
Yeah, I mean, I think the accountability and people being removed, I've dealt with in my talk, and the one thing I do want to pick up on, though, because it can be very damaging, is the point around quotas. So we don't have quotas. That's not what this is about. I want to reiterate, you know, people are appointed into their roles on merit. And the issue about one protected characteristic over another, I get asked this again a lot. And I will say a couple of things about this. First of all, it's the wrong question. If you look at our organization, the data demonstrates that the problems we have are in the areas of ethnicity and gender. And going back to something I said previously, I always talk about ethnicity and gender in the same breath, because that's the issue we've had, and that's where the pay gaps, etc., have to be driven. What's always interesting to me is I only ever get challenged on the race element of that, never the gender element. And so in our organization, I can demonstrate, you know, in terms of the other protected characteristics, race and gender is where our problem is. But I just want to be very clear, this is never at the expense of a different protected characteristic. It doesn't mean that those protected characteristics get any less of our attention, and they're not any less important. There's also a thing around intersectionality, and there's also very clearly in our organization, all of the people in our organization with protected characteristics have benefited from this approach. Going back to what I said before about our staff networks having grown up, we've got an ABLE network, we've got a rainbow network, we've got a family network, and these networks are all working with our organization to help make it better. And what we're seeing, just using disability as an example, because that's one of the things Sarah mentioned, is 7% of our organization, 6 or 7 years ago declared that they had a disability, and we knew that that was way below, you know, the national average, and we are a microcosm of society. That's now up at around 17% of our organization declaring that they have a disability. And the reason why that's happening is because people are, again, seeing an organization that's prepared to act, to engage, to try to be better in this space. So it's not about quotas, never has been. And it's not one protected characteristic over another.
Thank you so much for your response, Stuart. We're going to move on to Mandy now. So Mandy, would you like to take your microphone off to ask your question? Mandy, are you able to continue there? Okay, we're not getting any response from Mandy. All right, what we'll do is we are going to move on. I understand that we've got a question from Professor Miller. Professor Miller, are you ready to ask your question?
Absolutely. Thank you for such a thought-provoking lecture, Stuart. Really, really insightful. You use an important metaphor very early on in your talk, where you talked about, you know, apartheid require a sledgehammer to you know, for his demolition. But then you also made the point that racism can't be cracked with a sledgehammer. And I like the metaphor, but I wonder. I know we're talking about hearts and minds and leadership and so on, but I wonder if there's a similarly drastic mechanism that you would recommend for tackling racism, especially because we've tried doing the culture piece. We've tried with all kinds of accountability matrices. But in some of my writing, as you know, I argue that in the UK, racism is so deeply sedimented in the psyche and fiber of our institutions that for every one person who is anti-racist, there are 100 who are anti-racist. So I wonder then if there's a similar sledgehammer or something else we could use.
I think for me, and again, this is something that I have been criticized for saying before, but I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, and that's about that 20% and the people who need to be pushed under the bus. I think leaders have a responsibility to tackle this, root it out where they see it, and remove people from their organizations who are doing that damage. And I have done that in my time in this role. You know, people have left the organization. Sometimes they've left badly, and it's not you know, it has resulted in a fair amount of what I referred to earlier, that kind of attack that quite often is behind my back. But it's my responsibility. And it is a responsibility of other leaders as well. And part of what I've been trying to do is get the rest of our leaders taking the same approach. So I think the sledgehammer is, from a leadership point of view, get rid of anybody who's not doing this authentically, get rid of the malicious compliance, remove those people from your organization. That 20%, and I have said this very openly to our organization, if you're in the 20%, there's the door. Just go. I have no interest in trying to change your mind or move you on. My interest is in the 80% and getting the 80% where they want to be.
Okay, thank you for that, Stuart. I'm going to move on to Poppy. Poppy, are you happy to take your yeah, brilliant. All right, so I'm going to invite Poppy, who has a comment and maybe a question.
Hey Stuart, I'm an advocate also, and it was great to hear you talk. Do you know, I don't know that mine is a direct question, but let me just sort of pose the thought that was coming up in my mind. One of the self-care narrative has changed significantly between the 1950s and where we're at now. You type in self-care and you get bath bombs and facial massages, right? But actually, and you might be aware of this already, Stuart, given the deep thinking that you've been done on this, and other colleagues, the academics, definitely probably will be aware. But in the 1950s, self-care was a radical movement created by the Black Panther movement as part of the civil rights movement, because Black people weren't getting the same, part of the reason was Black people weren't getting the same access to healthcare, etc. So the burnout for activism was incredibly high. So what the communities did was organize to put in initiatives for self-care, which might have been women supporting support groups. It might, and the idea was, in order to change systems, we had to fight racism and change systems long term. We had to take care of ourselves, and self-care was a community action. And I guess where I'm going with this is, given how my perception of society at the moment, and I speak, through the lens of sort of observing my children, the community around me, is individualization. How do I look after me, and how do I get what I need? And I'm not saying that's universal, but that's a feeling. That's the first thing, particularly in Western cultures. Whereas, I come from a Bangladeshi community, and I often say this, my disposable income is not the same as my white counterparts, because I look after lots of families before I go on holiday. It's a different mindset, but that too is shifting in the generations coming forward. I love what you've said about equalities groups, community groups, employee resource groups that coming together, and I guess doing a little bit of that community activism, like self-care, supporting each other so that we go forward as a group and we don't burn out. I think there's a risk for leaders like yourselves who are wearing with pride their too woke badge, because actually it feels like every angle of society is coming for you. And I guess there's something here about, if you're also a Black woman, a brown woman, a disabled brown woman, there is more vulnerability. So how do we strengthen and go back to self-care being a community act? And is there any examples of how you think you've done that intentionally? I can see that you've done a lot of that within your organization unintentionally, but is that something that you think we should be giving more attention to? Yeah, and just briefly to say, in the 60s, self-care movement was taken by the medical society to actually then go, well, actually, this is about patient agency. And that journey has moved to where we're at today, where we're talking about marketeers basically selling to us. And I really need a shift in mindset. I invite a shift in mindset so that we can be stronger together.
Yeah. So I think there's two parts of that for me. I think this is critical, and actually it is one of the things that came out really strongly on the back of the pandemic, that point around self-care. And it is something that all staff briefing I mentioned that we started during the pandemic, we still keep it going. So once a week I do an all staff, and it's a very kind of informal, but I constantly talk about the need to look after each other as well as yourself. And we use the airline example where, if the oxygen mask come down, put on your face first and then those around you. And it's very, my constant message is you all have to be okay in order to do your job. So first and foremost, make sure you and your loved ones are okay. Now, I appreciate that is beginning to go to the individual, but what we are trying to do is that the organization, that our leaders enable that self-care, so the community, the organization becomes the community. That's the first part of it. And it's again, this is all down to leaders. It's down to how leaders lead. It's down to empathy. It's down to understand. It's down to kindness. A lot of time, everybody's dealing with something, so recognize that and just be kind. And the other bit of this that's been really important in terms of that community approach is creating those safe spaces for people to turn up and have, really challenging conversations. One of the most challenging things that happened to us in the last 18 months or so was what happened in October in Israel, and how that has played out. And frankly, how our organization responded to that, which was poor initially, I believe. But creating the spaces where people could turn up and say, I really am not comfortable with what's happened or how it's been dealt with, or so that self-care and the community element of it, we're trying to make the whole organization effectively that space.
Thank you, Poppy, and thank you so much, Stuart. So, just conscious of the time, but we have two more questions. It may mean that we'll run over slightly. So, hopefully, colleagues are able to stay to hear those responses to Mandy and Mark's questions. But I'm going to ask Mandy's question for her because unfortunately her mic isn't working. So, Tony Ben stated, "What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom you're accountable? And how can we get rid of you? How can individuals destabilize status quo in organizations where the senior leadership groups promote the norm and they promote racism?"
Wow. So I think, I mean, that's really challenging. And I guess, sorry, I'm having a bit of an emotional response to that because I can't just, I mean, working in an environment like that must just be appalling. But I am also not naive enough to think that those environments don't exist. And I think there are things that I can say and do as a white man that others probably can't. So my response to that is not necessarily going to work for everybody. I think it's important to call it out. Being anti-racist is about doing that. It's calling it out. It's addressing it. It's being prepared to know that when you do that, there's a possibility that that's going to be the end of your employment. Now, I want to reiterate, it's easy for me to sit here and say that. I completely understand that. I have spoken to a couple of leaders who work in organizations where this has happened. And my message to them was that there's two things you can do. One is what I've just said, you call it out and you potentially either walk away or you get pushed, which might be my approach. It might not be the right approach. The other thing to do is you are a leader and you still have responsibility for the people in your part of the organization. And so continue to lead those people with your values in the space, doing what's right, and continue to use your position to try and influence those around you. I've been in spaces before where, again, I have the privilege of being able to walk away. I get that. Not everybody does. Where I've wanted to walk away and people have said to me, don't. Rather stay around the table and try and make the change than walk away. Because once you walk away, then there's no dissenting voice. So yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer that because each individual situation is going to be different. But I think standing up to it or trying to find a way, if you don't believe you can do that and you want to stay, then try and find a way of affecting the change that you want to see in that organizational place that you happen to be.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just don't feel like there's a sufficient response to that. I'm really sorry, Mandy.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to move on to Mark, and Mark is going to have our final question for this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. You've said several times in the course of your discourse that culture changes things, not processes or policies. Absolutely, wholeheartedly agree. My question really is, the protected characteristics of the 2010 Equality Act could be argued they've ghettoised and actually created divisions and not done what it was set out to do in the first place, because the individual people groups within that are arguing for their own cause, and actually it's become exclusive rather than inclusive. And my question is, if I'm involved in initial teacher education, and so there's a curriculum review currently under way with the Labour government, what would you suggest to Bridget Phillipson and the DFE in terms of changing the culture of education so that we can actually undo the damage? Because as you say, it's not processes, policies that actually do it. It's the culture. So how are we going to change the culture of education, and what would you suggest that they include within the curriculum review to address that?
So my first, and I have a little bit of experience of this through our organization, the first thing I would suggest is that the DfE accepts that there is structural racism in the current curriculum. We have approached them with that before, and this is based on children in Westminster, in our schools, saying that they don't see themselves in the curriculum. We just got a flat, battered away, no conversation to be had. Yeah, there's no problem. So first of all, recognizing and understanding that there is an issue, when you have children saying that we don't see ourselves in the curriculum that we're being taught. And, you know, I can point to some sort of, I don't have children, unfortunately, but I have godchildren, and I was visiting them, and on the wall of that very young, and on the wall of one of the rooms, they had a map of the world, and the map of the world had cartoon characters representing different countries. And on the map of the world, there was not one black child. Not one. Africa was represented by somebody wearing Arabic clothing. And I said to my godchildren's parents, do you not see what I'm seeing? That there is not one, your kids who are growing up, I have to say, in one of the least diverse parts of this country, but are not, like, do you not see what I'm seeing and the problem that this creates? And the short answer they gave me was, no, we don't understand. We don't see what you're seeing. And I think that message back into the DfE about the importance of the curriculum, and the curriculum representing our kids is just absolutely crucial. So that's what my message would be. Understand that there's a problem first and foremost, then we can work with you to help work out how to address that.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Mark. Okay.
You're muted, Kelly.
Oh, apologies. I've just thanked Stuart, and I've also thanked Mark. So, look, as we approach the conclusion of our session, I'd like to just summarise a few key points that Stuart made in his lecture. He highlighted the importance of accountability, authenticity, and the need for sort of cultural transformation to ensure that EDI becomes part of your organisation's and a kind of an organisational DNA. Stuart challenged us to all take action, to moving from that idea of being supporters to active accomplices in this extremely vital work. So on behalf of the Institute, and I'm sure all colleagues here who've joined, we want to thank you, Stuart, for your thought-provoking insights. I want to thank all of the attendees for dedicating your time to engage in this extremely important conversation about EDI. Your participation is incredibly crucial in driving these conversations and discussions forward. I'd also like to take the opportunity as an EDI fellow to share some great news with you about the Institute and that they've recently received validation. So we've recently received validation for our MBA, the first of its kind in EDI, and more information will be coming and be shared with you on that shortly. So it's an MBA in Leadership for Equity, Inclusion and Organisational Development. So look out for that. That will be starting in September. So look, finally from me, let's continue to work together towards a more equitable and inclusive future. Thank you everyone for joining the conversation tonight. And of course, thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and the Institute.